I'll show you a Batman panel from a 1986 comic that's very different from what we see today, which I find interesting. The panel comes in issue 10 of Crisis on Infinite Earths. A story where the most powerful heroes of the multiverse were about to face one of the most dangerous villains in comic book history. The Anti-Monitor possessed the ability to obliterate whole universes. In the middle of this cosmic fight, Robin talks to Batman and says, "Batman, we don't have powers, what can we do?" To which Batman responds, "Can we share our courage? Can we give them hope?" A dialogue like this today would be rare, because we are already more accustomed to seeing Batman fighting side by side with the most powerful heroes of his universe, or defeating the Justice League itself even though he has no powers. However, we also have stories where he struggles against very human villains like Two-Face. It's as if culturally we coexist with two different versions of Batman, had you noticed? But it wasn't always like this, as initially he was simply a detective with combat skills and a lot of willpower. However, nowadays he is so dangerous that his evil versions can put the entire universe at risk. Detective Comics. How did Batman change so much and when did he become so powerful? In this video, we will revisit and expand on a topic I covered on my channel around 5 years ago. My name is Gio the Geek Monitor, and this is the go cut of my video about Batman's power levels. Like every superhero, the version of Batman we know today is very different from the one we saw in his first appearance. In the beginning, Batman was this extremely dark and human character, which derived directly from low-budget comic books called pulp magazines, which featured stories of violent crimes and were popular in the mid-30s. This made his early comics have this detective focus that was common in those stories, so Batman regularly faced common criminals, and gradually he began to face villains with special characteristics like Joker or Catwoman. And yes, that was Catwoman's first suit. However, despite their quirks, all these villains were still human. That is, in the early Batman stories, we didn't see superpowers anywhere. And this is particularly because the main idea behind Batman was to create a superhero different from Superman. But that could share the sales success that the Man of Steel had at that time. As Superman gained popularity, Detective Comics aimed to create a character that was comparable yet distinct. So the Batman stories focused on emphasizing the detective and human side of the character. So we saw him struggle when facing the most common criminals. The most fascinating aspect of Batman was the mystery behind each case, not the punches. In 1952, Detective Comics chose to unite its two most iconic superheroes, Batman and Superman, in a single comic for the first time. The first story in which they would team up and combine their skills to stop nothing more and nothing less than a diamond thief. The gradual changes might seem insignificant to us now, but they were likely impressive to children at the time. Especially since Detective Comics had been publishing titles like World's Finest for years, where both characters appeared on the cover but inside they had separate stories. And well, this comic is very important to understand how Batman's focus was changing and why. In this story, which we saw in Superman 76, Clark Kent and Bruce Wayne share a cabin on a cruise where a diamond thief is suspected to be traveling. However, despite his X-ray vision, Superman is not able to find said loot, so Batman has to deduce its whereabouts and decipher how this thief hides the diamonds from Superman. Throughout this comic, the Man of Steel uses his powers to keep the ship safe from some dangers while Batman rescues the people. The writers crafted the story in a way that allowed both characters to stand out, building a narrative that required Superman to use his powers but also involved some mystery that Batman could solve. This was a pattern that repeated when these two characters shared a story, with the difference that Superman was often weakened with kryptonite for the sake of the plot, and to make Batman look good, so the overall strategy was to keep Superman busy or weakened and give Batman a case to solve. But this changed with the Justice League comic. When Batman joined the Justice League, he started interacting with other superpowered characters besides Superman for the first time. So the writers had to find a way for Batman to be on par with them without falling behind. In these comics then, we see a considerable power increase in Batman, since he had to fight against powerful supervillains along with other members of the League. And one of the ways the writers kept Batman relevant within the team was making him the tactical mind or the strategist behind the Justice League. So we often saw how his plans were executed by the rest of the team, which gave them the victory. This version of the strategist Batman is something we can still see in modern comics and adaptations. like the Batman version of Justice League Unlimited, where we also see him adopt this strategist role that within the comics, but outside of them. There was a version that was about to dramatically lower Batman's power levels, returning him to a much more human and even comic tone. In 1966, 6 years after Batman first joined the Justice League, the Batman television series premiered starring Adam West, a show that introduced an approach peculiar of the character. The idea behind the show was that Batman should not be taken too seriously, so all his abilities were ridiculed in a certain way. To begin with, Batman was captured by a criminal and his henchmen in every episode. He had gadgets for the most absurd situations you could imagine. He danced to the rhythm of swing and he solved riddles that made no sense. With yellow skin, he writes using a banana pen. Often Robin, not Batman, solved the riddle. Despite the odds, the series achieved immense success and had a long-running span. This version of Batman defined the public perception of the character, turning Batman into a cultural icon through the 66 series. One that, as we can see, was extremely human, imperfect, and was far from being on the power level of the rest of his Justice League colleagues. Something that was also taken up in the comics, but with a dark focus instead of a comic one. In 1970, a journalist named Denny O'Neil would start writing the Batman character, and his idea was to use his experience reporting crime news to bring Batman back. These dark stories would highlight his detective skills. A Batman who would become very human again, but that doesn't mean it was boring to read. In his stories, Joker returned to being the killer he was in the beginning. He introduced fascinating characters like Ra's al Ghul and delved into Bruce Wayne's humanity and fragility. Through stories like Batman Venom, one that presents us with one of the most human and imperfect Batmans we've ever seen in history. This one you see here is Batman going through a detoxification process after being addicted to a substance called Venom, which increased his strength. It all started months ago when Faiyal saved a little girl because he wasn't strong enough. This made Batman lose self-confidence, leaving him vulnerable to manipulation by a scientist who started giving him Venom. This made Bruce much stronger, but gradually also turned him into a slave dependent on these pills. His attitude changed as he fought with Alfred and was blackmailed by the scientist, all to maintain his dose. The scientist ultimately requests Batman to kill Jim Gordon, a notion he briefly contemplates. But then he reconsiders and asks Alfred to lock him in the Batcave in order to overcome his addiction, where he was held captive for an entire month. This 1991 story is intriguing as it portrays an uncommon side of Batman. A person who can be manipulated through their insecurities and develop addictions. Something that deviates from the ideal Batman we usually envision. Bane's more human portrayal was also evident in other stories like 1994's Nightfall, where he defeats Batman. Not because he's better than him in hand-to-hand combat, but because he developed a whole strategy in which he releases the Arkham inmates to gradually and over several weeks exhaust Bruce Wayne, who has to face all the fugitives without rest. When Bane confronts an exhausted, sleep-deprived Batman, he easily overpowers him. He ends up near death with a broken back. This more human Batman approach was happening in his solo comics. But at the same time, there were completely different stories that proposed the idea that Batman could defeat Superman. In 1986, Frank Miller introduced the iconic comic The Dark Knight Returns, a story about a 50-year-old Batman who returns to fight crime after years of absence. In the initial 3 issues, this comic presented a relatable Batman, already grappling with the effects of aging. And he even mentions several times within the comic that he got out of some trouble purely by luck. In fact, it's so much so that he almost dies when he confronts the leader of the mutants or Joker with punches. However, this changes for issue 4. Who wins in a fight, Superman or Batman? The Dark Knight Returns is often mentioned in response to this question, where Batman wears an armor that uses the power of Gotham City's electrical grid to be able to exchange blows with Superman. At one point in the fight, Batman manages to subdue the Man of Steel, and he says to him, "I want you to remember, Clark, in all the years to come, in your most private moments, I want you to remember my hand at your throat. I want you to remember the one man who beat you." This dialogue is crucial as its excellent writing and dramatic nature overshadow other aspects of the fight. Like the fact that Batman had help from Green Arrow and Robin, and that Superman really didn't want to hurt Bruce. But all things considered, this dialogue completely changed our perception of Batman. I think it was the exact moment when we culturally accepted the notion that the deadliest superhero could challenge the most powerful one through cunning, wit, and willpower. And if he was able to do that to Superman, then it makes all the sense in the world that he is now capable of taking on the entire Justice League. From there, other stories emerged that emphasize these characteristics of Batman. An example of this was seen in the Justice League of America run by Grant Morrison, a comic series where Morrison wanted to make it clear that each member of the Justice League was the equivalent of a mythological god. So from the beginning, he sought a way to establish Batman as a character who was on par with the others. In his first arc, he had the entire League captured by white Martians, leaving only Batman free to save them. In this comic, we see how the white Martians make the mistake of underestimating Batman, despite Superman warning them that they have let the most dangerous man in the world go free. A similar event occurred in the first arc of the Justice League cartoon, where Batman is also the one who saves his teammates, with whom he stops an alien invasion. And I think this is a great example of how today we have two versions of Batman cohabiting in our minds. In Batman, the animated series, we see a dark human and grounded knight who struggles against his villains. But this same Batman is capable of facing cosmic threats in the Justice League cartoon. Morrison often portrays Batman as an extremely dangerous character, capable of commanding armies of superheroes in his stories. Like the crossover that the Justice League has with the Wildcats, or that story where he coordinates two Justice League teams. Over time, in an attack against the sun god of the 853rd century. He has also written stories presenting Batman with extraordinary abilities like having a backup personality. The Suriner's Batman for when someone tries to attack his mind. Or the time when Darkseid realizes that he can't clone Batman, because the clones self-destruct and gouge out their eyes because no one can handle the level of stress that Batman manages. Another adaptation worth mentioning regarding Batman's power levels is Batman the Brave. Because contrary to most versions where Superman is the central hero of the universe, this cartoon revolves around Batman and his relationship with other superheroes. In some episodes, it is directly stated that he is the greatest hero of all time. He frequently confronts intergalactic threats with no traces of Superman in the initial seasons. There are also stories where Batman defeats the Justice League. In the comic Tower of Babel by Mark Waid, Ra's al Ghul steals Batman's secret plans to incapacitate the Justice League, in case they turn evil. A comic that was later adapted into the animated movie Justice League Doom, a movie that became very popular among comic readers and beyond. So it's usually taken as a reference when someone discusses Batman's power levels. Scott Snyder used a similar approach in the Batman Endgame comic, in which Batman has to quickly incapacitate the Justice League when it is controlled by Joker. All these stories reinforce the idea that Batman is capable of facing anything with enough preparation time. Something that in recent years has gone even further with concepts like the Hellbat armor. I suggest following me on Instagram. Today, I shared an infographic with Batman comic recommendations for beginner to advanced readers. The Hellbat armor is a kind of exoskeleton created thanks to the abilities of several members of the Justice League with which Bruce is able to face threats. The armor grants Batman Darkseid level power but also drains his energy, risking death if used for an extended period. The Batman Who Laughs, a fusion of Joker and Bruce Wayne, quickly became one of Detective Comics' most popular villains and has been featured as a multiversal threat in numerous stories. Through stories like Metal, why is this character so powerful and dangerous? The justification given within the story is that the Batman Who Laughs is a Batman with all his advantages and none of his ethical limits. So we're talking about a Dark Knight who retains his intellect, preparation, and obsession with control. But combined with the sadism and chaotic way of thinking of the Joker. I like the character, but I also think it's a big script. The Laughing Batman symbolizes the notion that combining two immensely popular characters with a powerful script makes them nearly invincible, even though it doesn't make much sense objectively. So this character represents for me the culmination of an idea that began to take shape in the Dark Knight Returns comic 38 years ago. That Batman always wins because he's Batman, but should we ask ourselves if a character is really better when he's more powerful? Despite enjoying the Metal comic, I never fully connected with its story or characters. While there are other comics where we see a much more human Batman, like The Long Halloween, which for me are infinitely better in terms of narrative and story. However, this does not mean that the approach of the super powerful Batman does not work. Comics like this, where Batman leads the heroes against the most powerful computer, or cartoons like Justice League Unlimited, showcase this theme. Do an excellent job showing us a very dangerous Batman, who is a very important member of the Justice League, without falling into the Batman wins because he's Batman trope, which is also seen in Batman, the Brave and the Bold, another adaptation depicting a very powerful Batman. That still managed to have fun, exciting, and even emotional stories. Both approaches work in Batman because his vast history makes both versions valid and capable of coexisting. And while his solo adventures usually present us with a less powerful version which focuses more on his detective skills, I also love to see him fight alongside his league mates. However, we must remember that the most important thing of all is that the story is good. Here are some of the best Batman comics if you're interested. I posted an infographic on Instagram to help you decide what to buy. Follow me and subscribe for more videos on this topic. That's all for today. I am Go. Keep looking beyond the obvious.